Welcome, everyone. My name is Kimberly Bradley. I'm the Conversations Curator at Art Basel in Basel. I'll take the liberty here to reiterate this panel's description, which will offer deep insight into art market issues in uncertain times. With multiple elections in key art markets this year, how will shifting politics affect the legal and financial frameworks concerned with the art market? What macroeconomic trends should we be aware of? Our panelists will discuss how galleries and collectors can best prepare for the upcoming changes. Joining us to the furthest from me is Katalin Andreides, who leads a specialist art law practice based in Rome, advising international clients through the legal and regulatory regimes applicable to the art market. She has also worked as head of legal for an art foundation working internationally with leading contemporary artists and has published widely on issues concerning the art market and cultural heritage. Next to her is Vere-Hodge, who heads up the art and cultural property team at London-based law firm Payne Hicks Beach and advises private collectors, dealers, galleries, museums, and governments on all matters pertaining to artworks and artifacts. Next to him is Paul Donovan, the chief economist of UBS Global Wealth Management. He's responsible for developing and presenting the UBS Economic Outlook, marketing the UBS view on economics, policy, and politics around the world. Paul is a member of the Global Investment Committee and sits on the UBS Art Board. And moderating our conversation today is London-based journalist and author Georgina Adam. She is editor-at-large for the Art newspaper and a contributor to the Financial Times. Her latest book is The Rise and Rise of the Private Art Museum, published in 2021. Let's give all of our speakers and moderator a big round of applause. There will be time for questions at the end of the hour, and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome to all of you. We're so happy to see so many of you, and I think that you're going to have really a fantastic conversation here. We have these great panelists who have extensive knowledge about turbulent times, and I hope none of you are feeling seasick, because we're talking about navigating a sea of uncertainty. So I'm going to start by asking each of our esteemed panelists one question, which is the same question for all of them. What do you see as the greatest area of instability in the art market in the coming year? And each of them will give their point of view from their particular specialization. And then we'll move on to a general discussion about other aspects, but those aspects will probably be covered already a little bit. So we're going to start with Paul. You're an economist. Tell us, what do you see?
So, thank you, Georgina. We need to start generally, and we'll narrow down to the art world in a moment. But we're in a period of extraordinary economic turmoil, what economists call the fourth industrial revolution, arguably the most dramatic economic change that we've had in 250 years. I mean, this is really very disruptive. And what happens when you get these periods of economic upheaval is some people go up and some people go down in terms of income, in terms of security, and in terms of social status. And the group on the way down fairly obviously do not like the fact that they're losing income, security, and status. And what is worse is they're going down and their neighbors going up. And that always makes things worse. And so what we then get, and we have had this over the last 200 years, is you then get what we call scapegoat economics. It's not my fault I lost my job. Well, it isn't. You've done your job to the best of your ability. It's just things have changed. So you then go to, well, it's not my fault I lost my job. It must be the fault of, insert the name of a minority group. It must be the fault of immigrants or foreigners or women in the workforce or drag queens reading stories. It doesn't matter what you do. You find a minority group to go after. And then you get the prejudice politics, the politician that comes along and says, vote for me, we'll build a wall, we'll keep them out. And we can all think of instances of that around the world today. Now, this, I think, has a significant bearing on where we're going in the art market and the challenges, because one of the easiest groups to blame, always, is the foreigner. A very convenient group to blame. The British have been blaming the French for 1,000 years for everything that goes wrong in the UK. And so you then start to see this economic nationalism, barriers to trade, barriers to global flows, movement of people, and that becomes a challenge. And then associated with this, in an environment where, again, you're getting scapegoat economics, prejudice politics, artists will be part of those groups that are being attacked. The attacks on the queer community over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, good case in point. So this instability and this uncertainty is creating a more hostile environment, which is potentially very disruptive to a global market, and a global market that relies on diversity of talent and experience.
Gosh.
Sorry.
Yes.
Negative way to start.
There we are. That's the way it is.
Is.
Till.
Thanks, Georgina. Thanks, Paul, for an excellent way of setting the scene from an economic perspective. I think from a legal perspective, in particular from a London-based legal perspective, Paul is absolutely right, I think, to say that at times of upheaval, you can see, trade blocks and legal systems either diverge or align. And I think in the world that we have now, that is post-Brexit, post-pandemic, after a period of sustained high inflation, after energy crises due to geopolitical instabilities and conflicts, notably, of course, the war in Ukraine, and a raft of elections coming up and having already happened across many parts of the world, including this year the US, the UK, the EU, France, and India, just to name a handful. There is a lot of uncertainty. So when we first thought about this topic, Katalin and I drafted an article for Claire McAndrew's fantastic report on that topic. We were thinking of how do we translate that into what's going on legally and from a regulatory framework. And so what we did was try and look at the sort of cultural policies that affect the international art trade. And I think that's, at that point, as a reminder, of course, there is no one regulation in any jurisdiction that pertains exclusively to the art world. And also, there is no one supervisory body in any jurisdiction that I know of that regulates the art trade. So what we had to look at was a sort of broad range of disciplines, from compliance, regulation, tax, customs rules, etc. And also, of course, rules that are trying to play catch-up with areas where innovation and technology has already run away. So this big picture, just to say that from a UK art lawyers perspective, I think the one thing to really look out for in this age of uncertainty is, will the UK diverge further from its main trading partners and therefore the UK art market, or will there be closer alignment again in the future going forward?
Well, that's great, thank you. And I would remind you that you can download and read the UBS report, the UBS Art Basel report, which has exactly an article by Till and by Katalin, and of course supervised by Paul. So, and it is really worth reading. So do, if you haven't read it already, read it. So, Katalin.
Yes.
So you're a Rome-based lawyer.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think from the European angle, I think that from the European political angle, what I think that in the light of the recent European elections and the results of these elections, I think that questions and those matters that require political agreement are more exposed to uncertainties. If we look at the environmental transition, for example, or the environmental development of the art market, this is typically this is a field that requires further regulation. and political decisions will need to be made, and I think it will be a problem. I mean, not problem, but we are looking at a very fragmented European politics. So this is why I think that, for example, the environmental transition is a problem, or it will be a question, because political decisions may slow down the decarbonization process. Well, from the EU regulatory angle, I would say two things. The very first one is this quite ambitious European objective to trace the movement and the trade of cultural goods. Generally speaking, there are measures that reflect this intention. For example, the EU import regulation, it's not a new regulation, but it will be in place next year. Or also the new system, new anti-money laundering system, the new anti-money laundering regime. These are measures that reflect all this intention, these objectives of the European Union to trace and to get more and more information about cultural goods, cultural property, and also about their holders. So this is another very interesting field. And lately, yeah, an imminent problem, I would say, this new amendment to the EU VAT system that we know all about this, I guess, that needs to be transposed by European countries by the end of this year. And we don't know, for example, how Italy will react, how Belgium react. They are important countries with relatively dynamic art markets. So this is something that is important not only for European players, but also for non-European players, having typically only one space within the EU. So for them, it will be a strategic question how they, where they establish their space. And probably they will establish this space, their business, where trading conditions are more favorable.
Yeah. So thank you. So we're going to dig down onto VAT. We're going to dig down more into money laundering. But firstly, I'd like to talk about an element of instability, which is politics. And since when we started preparing this panel, we didn't have a date for the British elections, and the French, although the European elections were about to happen, we had no idea that Macron would call a snap French election. So perhaps, Paul, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about possible impact?
So I think the UK election is, of all the elections we've got globally, including what's going on in the States, the UK is, from an economic point of view, perhaps one of the easier ones to deal with, because there is, how can I put this delicately, less uncertainty about the UK election outcome than is the case in France or in the States. And so with that, I think there is an expectation of a change of government in the UK, which is near universal in the markets and I think in society at large. Now, that raises, I think, some interesting questions, because with the potential for a change of government in the UK, I don't think we should get carried away about UK relations with Europe. The Labour Party has got members who are just as hostile to Europe as the Conservative Party does. But I think the fact that it is a new government and it is not the party that was responsible for exiting the UK from the EU, I think that perhaps changes the tone of the relationship with Europe. At least I hope that it does, and some of the rather petty differences can be smoothed away. Substantially, the UK remains outside, but some of the differences can be smoothed away. On the other hand, I think if we look at what is happening in France and the aftermath of Europe, here I think it is the change of the narrative. The far right in Europe did make gains, obviously, but they didn't make overwhelming gains. To quote van der Leyden, the centre still held in Europe. It has held. But I think that the narrative in Europe has shifted to a more populist narrative, and that's something which potentially, it builds prejudice politics, it puts in place barriers. That is something we're going to continue to see, I think.
So when we were preparing this talk, one of the things that you mentioned was what will happen to the Conservative Party.
Yeah. So I think this is this has always been an issue. If the Conservative Party, as expected, suffer a relatively heavy defeat, what then happens to them? And we have precedents in the UK where in 1997, after Tony Blair was elected from the Labour Party, the Conservatives went to the right and then spent a long period in opposition because they went far away from the political centre, and then they came back. If you look at the Labour Party, they went to the extreme left with Jeremy Corbyn and then have come back under Keir Starmer. It's not clear. I mean, this is the interesting thing with the position of the Conservative Party now. So many seats are vulnerable that the right of the party is likely to suffer as badly as the left. And so there may be a bit of a battle for who controls. There is, however, a general trait, which is not just the UK, this applies across almost all Western democracies, that membership of political parties is in decline. And that has implications. What is happening is that things like social media enable people to campaign for single issues. You don't have to sign up to a party you don't agree with, half the manifesto. You can sign up for a single issue, get really passionate about that. And so membership of parties declines, but what that means is that, to put it bluntly, only fanatics join political parties. And so the political parties are becoming more and more extreme. And so this again is an issue, not, as I said, just for the UK, we've got this very much in Europe, that parties are becoming more extreme relative to the majority of the electorate. That's also going to be complicating politics still further.
Till, one of the things we discussed as well when we were is divergence and non-divergence. And as a London-based lawyer, perhaps you could talk a bit about, maybe it's crystal ball, but what is...
Yes, great question. So I think the point that Paul was making about the political process or politics essentially leading to pressure to almost engage in a sort of reductionist analysis of topics and really go for something that can be sold to your electorate rather than something that perhaps economically makes more sense, can be seen, I think, in various issues. The first point that I'd sort of picked out, though, for illustrative purposes, is sort of the compliance issues, where I think and I hope that actually there will remain quite a lot of alignment, certainly when it comes to sanctions, which is, of course, an issue which greatly affects the art trade, because, of course, everybody needs to check that whoever they're dealing with as their counterparty is not, sanctioned and can be traded with freely. And traditionally, those sanctions have been, or historically, many of them were UN Security Council driven, which means that you already had a worldwide consensus to build those sanctions. Now, in recent years, with geopolitical issues, a sort of Western regime has developed on top of that, and to deal with issues where there wasn't a Security Council consensus available. Now, whether that will fragment further is obviously a possibility, but even if there is political instability on domestic levels within the West, it's quite unlikely that that sort of speaking with one voice on foreign policy issues and having a direct effect on the art market through that will shift substantially. When you, however, look at other compliance disciplines, like money laundering, for example, I think there is a lot happening there. And, for example, the US regulators have, I think, so far at least, remained relatively light-handed in the way they've gone about regulating the money laundering issues in the US art market, and have taken the view that the US art market is not necessarily a hotbed for criminal activity. And when you compare that with the UK regulators, the tonal divergence is potentially substantial, because earlier this year, for example, the UK Treasury brought out what they called an amber alert, saying that, in particular, the art storage industry was particularly open to criminal activity. And I think in doing so, again, coming to the reductionist approach, it gave as justification for that assessment that apparently they discovered that millions of artworks are in storage. That shouldn't be a great surprise.
No surprises there.
No. that artworks always necessarily have to appreciate in value over time. I'm not sure everyone agrees on that.
No.
And thirdly, that artworks can be liquidated by those criminals who are using them as and when needed. That also is not that easy, as we all know. So the UK, authorities equally, I think, sometimes indulge in sort of relatively generic statements and reductionist approaches. From my point of view, of course, it would be much preferable if they perhaps took a leaf out of the US approach in that regard and were a little bit less heavy-handed. On the other hand, they might also take inspiration from the EU, and I know that a lot is happening on money laundering in the EU at the moment, so I think, Katalin, you probably have something to say on that.
Yes.
Well, yes, I have.
EU, and perhaps also more about VAT, because since we prepared this panel, Germany has, there's sort of quite a battle royal going on, isn't there? Yes. So please tell us a bit more about that.
Well, yes. So, the question around the VAT, the EU VAT regime, now there is this new amendment to the regime, meaning that now the directive extends the list of the products and services that member states can apply reduced VAT to. So now artworks, collector's items and antiques are eligible for reduced VAT. It wasn't the case before, but before European countries had the option already to apply reduced VAT for art imports, and also they also had the option to apply a kind of special arrangement, the so-called margin scheme, to our transactions.
Can you just explain what the margin scheme is very briefly?
It's just that you apply the standard rate only on the profit that you make.
Right.
On the
So
transaction.
not on the whole price, just on the profit you make
exactly.
when you buy and then resell an
object. Totality of the price, but only on the profit, which is an important point, because in countries such as Italy, France, and also in Belgium, it was a predominant choice by galleries. So this is a very important thing. Now, this new amendment doesn't allow anymore for the cumulative application of the reduced VAT and to apply the margin scheme on our transactions. Meaning that European countries will have to make their choice whether they either they apply the import VAT for artworks, or they give the possibility for the galleries to apply the standard VAT only on the margin. So it's not possible anymore. They have to make the choice by the end of this year, as I mentioned even before, which is here.
Which is in 6 months just now. Here, yes. I mean, it's very close.
So what we saw already, the French solution is quite a pragmatic, fantastic solution. They reacted quite quick, in my view. So they abandoned the whole system on the margin. It's quite a complex system. And they introduced a special tax regime on our transactions that is applicable to all the chain of the transactions, meaning the primary market, the secondary market, and also it is applicable to acquisitions by museums, which is very important. So this is the point. And we know that there have been similar lobbying activities in Belgium. We know that, but we don't know yet whether it is successful or not.
Yes, that's the Belgian trade has been lobbying the government.
Yes, exactly. They've been lobbying, yes. And then we know that as part of a comprehensive reorganization of the in Italy, I'm talking about Italy. So there is a comprehensive reorganization of the fiscal regime that is applicable to the art trade. The Italian government has already committed, I wouldn't say committed because it's only a draft law, but it's written that they are considering to further reduce the import VAT, because in Italy we have a reduced VAT that is applicable to art imports. So they are considering to further reduce this VAT and to apply this reduced rate to all transactions. But we don't know whether it's just that they are considering to introduce this, I mean, basically following the French path. So it's a question, and knowing the Italian government, that I really, absolutely, I want to defend the Italian government, not the government, but Italy, generally speaking, because this is absolutely true that everything is very difficult in Italy, but even in the chaos, you can find order. But knowing the government, probably they will make their choice at the very last minute. I mean, just before the deadline.
At midnight on the 31st of December.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we will see. We will see. But something they will have to make a choice, because if not, then because of the fact that they've got already reduced VAT that is applicable to the imports. If everything remains the same, they will have to apply 22% as the standard rate for all transactions that is not everything that is not import. So
that's reasonably disastrous, presumably.
It is a
for
disaster,
the trade.
yeah. But
yes.
Belgium is the same, because they've got 21%.
But the solution, of course, is you just import it into a country that's got low import and then move it on, don't you?
Yes, but this is also a very important point, that it doesn't really mean, because I've been reading around that, so you just have to choose one. I mean, if you, for example, you are based in somewhere Eastern Europe and, for example, in Hungary, where we've got 27% of the VAT rate, is quite high, but it's, so you are somewhere based there and you import an artwork from outside the EU that access, they access it in Belgium, for example, or in Italy or in France now for 5%. It doesn't mean that you have to pay only 5% VAT, import VAT. The VAT you will have to pay in the country where you sell. So if I buy in Hungary, I will have to pay the Hungarian VAT. So it is a complex issue, but absolutely, this is true. If you reduce the import VAT, it helps very much for the market. And it is very important, as I mentioned before, for non-European businesses. It is very important equally for non-European businesses, not only for European businesses, but for those non-European galleries, that there are many Americans or Brazilians that they choose typically only one country where they establish their business within the EU.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know, did you want to add anything to that?
Till wanted me to talk about the...
yes.
No.
Yes. Can you continue on in that case with anti-money laundering?
Because
yes.
then we are talking about Europe.
Yes, yeah.
No, just very quickly, I really don't want to go into the AML, but the EU AML regime is also important for Europeans, because we have now a new anti-money laundering, a new EU anti-money laundering regime. And this new anti-money laundering regime is part of a much wider European plan to trace, as I mentioned, the illicit trade of cultural goods. So this is an objective that even previous directives, anti-money laundering directives in the EU, that were, by the way, adopted also by the UK before Brexit,
yes,
weren't that much that specifically affected by this purpose. I mean, by these objectives. I mean, to trace cultural goods.
And just to interject, so that the traceability of, or trying to make artworks traceable is obviously, again, a sort of very reductionist approach, where you have the opinion that something needs to, we've never had registers of ownership of artworks, and sort of to try and do that, off the cuff is from zero is quite an undertaking, and probably has some sort of, dare I say it, populist sort of underpinnings.
Yeah. But I think on top of that, there's this problem of the 10,000 euros and the
Well, the number yes, the 10,000 euro relates to cash transactions.
Yes.
Because I was asked many times that it was already the case within the EU, but it wasn't the case. It was not a EU-wide limit, the 10,000 euro. I mean, the 10,000 euro is going to be now the limit. I mean, for cash transactions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Within the European Union.
Within the European Union,
yeah.
Yeah. So this is.
Paul, I'd like to come back to politics a little bit and to talk about, I mean, one of the things that we're facing, apart from a probable change of government in the UK, is the possibility that Trump will win. In which case, what effect could that have on the art trade? People probably exporting to America art?
Yeah.
What about tariffs? What is his position on tariffs?
So the first point to bear in mind with the US elections is we don't have an election in November. There are over 30,000 elections in November. And that matters because the composition of Congress has a bearing on what policy can happen. State and regional elections, the local elections can also actually be very significant. With the presidential election, however, and trade specifically, as you raised the point of tariffs, that is something that is under direct control of the US president. So it comes under the Commander-in-Chief powers, the 1916 Trading with the Enemy Act. The president has absolute control over tariffs. Whatever the president wants, they get. So I think there are two things that are worth highlighting here. The first, to the topic of this conversation, is the instability. So President Biden is absolutely not adverse to trade taxes. He's just imposed a load on US consumers. The thing is, with President Biden, he has tended to follow set, established procedures for deciding whether or not to impose a trade tax and how much that should be. If you look at President Trump's first term, there was far less of that sort of transparent process. I mean, I can remember during President Trump's term, I'd wake up in the morning, the first thing I would do is check Twitter to see what sort of policies had been implemented overnight, because it was that sort of random process. And that, of course, is Trump's style, but it adds an element of insecurity and instability into any kind of projection. The second thing is that Trump is being aggressive on tariffs. He is saying a 10% tariff on anything imported into the United States, 60% of it comes from China. Now, I do not believe that he will do this because it will be disastrous for the equity market. It will really hurt his support base. It's his supporters who would be most negatively affected by this. But I think he will do something. And again, if we go back to the first term, Trump imposed tariffs against Germany because he was arguing with Angela Merkel. And that included tariffs on paper, which then included works of art on paper created within the last 20 years. So all of a sudden, you suddenly find a part of the art trade is being affected by tariffs. I'm absolutely certain the Trump administration did not sit there and say, well, we don't like that artist, let's put a tariff on their work. But as an unintended consequence of a broader economic dispute, you got that. So I think that we will have more uncertainty about the possibility of taxes, because that's what tariffs are, being imposed overnight on the export of arts to the United States. That is certainly going to be a potential issue.
Gosh, so VAT, we're not quite sure what's going to happen. AML, anti-money laundering, perhaps a little clearer. Political situation, not clear. All of these are choppy waters, let's face it. But I want to move on to another aspect that you covered in your report, which is AI. And perhaps, Till, perhaps you could talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, and again, thank you, Georgina. Again, to put this into the sort of broader political context and competition among among jurisdictions or trade blocs and countries. So we've had, I think, a relatively divergent approach in relation to AI from a regulatory point of view, although, of course, regulation is still in its infancy. And the technology is running away with away from the regulators who are really trying to catch up. So nonetheless, the UK approach has been to make the UK an AI global superpower. That was the intended policy that was set out in a white paper last year. How did the UK government, the still current one, want to achieve that? Well, they said the regulation should be very much a principles-based regulation, no one regulator again, and be flexible enough for the UK art market to use AI, as long as AI users would then abide by and adhere to a set of non-enforceable, basically industry self-regulation. So I think, and Katalin can probably explain that the EU is taking a very different approach to that. But of course, from the UK's and the US is also doing something similar, principles-based. What are the potential advantages of doing that? Well, you can obviously create an environment where the AI industry can flourish. On the other hand, you may very well upset all the rights holders, artists, creative industries, and so forth, if you don't adequately protect the underlying rights and open everything up to AI technology. I think as far as alignment and divergence goes, I think the UK and the US are fairly closely aligned with that, but I think on the other side of the channel, there's a rather different approach.
Katalin, you would like to talk a bit about?
Well, yes, because in the EU now we have this first, this EU AI Act, which is the first comprehensive law to regulate the field. It is considered, or there have been criticisms that it is very restrictive and it's too soon, regulation is too soon at this very early stage of the technology, this rapidly evolving technology. Yes, so basically we have a law, it's binding regulation. It is very different from the American approach.
When you say we, you're talking about
yes,
EU.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
It doesn't
Not
mean anything.
Yeah.
No,
just
I'm
to
so
clarify.
No, it's just, yes, I'm sorry. So it's different from the American approach, because the American, as still mentioned, we have in America we have this policy-based approach based on voluntary guidelines around the products, artificial intelligence products, and also the important thing here that in case of non-compliance with these guidelines, you don't have actual penalties in place, which is totally different. It is the opposite, the European view, because under this new EU AI Act, you have, if these providers, these artificial intelligence providers, they don't comply with the law, then there are significant fines that can be imposed by this AI Act. But I would like to say just very quickly that this European AI Act has a very severe extraterritorial effect, meaning that if you are a provider and you train your algorithms outside of the European Union and you are based you are not an EU-based provider, but you are based outside of the European Union, but you provide your services into the EU, meaning that the output of this system is accessible by European customers, but this is accessible in the EU market. You will equally you will have to comply. You will have to comply with the EU AI Act.
Oh my gosh!
So it is quite. But I think that this is. I think that the European Union was always, so as I mentioned before, there have been criticism that it's too soon, regulation is too soon. But it wasn't always the case. The EU has not always that quick to regulate, because the EU, for example, started to regulate, started to deal with the digital transition in the EU quite late. The EU reacted quite late to Google's dominant position in the EU, so it was always a little bit late. And I think it's just an attitude that the EU wanted to learn the lesson. And I think the European Union, European legislators, they understood perhaps a little bit that, so they focused a little bit on the technology and innovation. It wasn't the case before. And they understood that transparency, it's an important thing regarding AI, because the AI products are very challenging for artists, authors, and the way they create creative content and they distribute the content. So they understood that transparency, even at this very early phase of the technology, is important. The protection of fundamental rights, it's very important, even at this very early phase of the technology. And also other questions like measures against competitive behavior, and all these things are very important even at this very early stage of the technology. So I wouldn't say, I don't know, I'm not a tech lawyer, or it's not, but just what I've been reading about this, and as a lawyer, I think it is not a bad thing to regulate, because we don't know anything about how it will impact our life, not only on the art market, but generally our everyday life. So I think it's not a bad idea to regulate at this very early stage of the technology.
So I'd like to stay with you, because something that we haven't discussed is sustainability. And here there are regulations in Europe that don't exist in either the American or the British market. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so internationally, not only in the EU, but we have quite ambitious climate targets already determined by international instruments, such as, for example, the Paris Agreement. This is one of the most famous international instruments, but also the UN Agenda 2030, also the European Green Deal, which we will not kiss goodbye to the European Green Deal, because I've heard after the French, after the results of the European elections, that someone commented like this in France. Anyway, so I think, yes, and then these targets are quite ambitious. That as I said, I prepare the targets. Anyway, so it's yes. So we need to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050, and we have to reduce it by 50% by the end of 2030. And the main important thing here is that businesses, public institutions, and in the art world is very important, because all the public institutions and also galleries, they have been already investing and allocating a significant amount of funds for this environment transition. Yes, so it's a very ambitious target. The problem again in the EU is the following: that why these targets are set at the EU level, which is fantastic, but to implement essential policies to achieve those targets remain national. So it will be a political decision, because the environmental transition is quite expensive. We all know this, and at the national level in the EU, it is a political decision. I mean, it's a question of budget, of course. It is a political decision, and I think that what we see, I mean, now we are going to have elections at the end of July, I think, in France. I don't think, I mean, I'm absolutely sure that these political decisions and political attitudes can significantly slow down the decarbonization process.
This is a question really for all of you. I mean, we are seeing Europe moving to the right on the whole. Britain is slightly the outlier. what is their attitude to the art market in general? I mean, is it going to be more positive, less positive? There's, for example, the Greens collapsed in the European vote.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the Greens totally collapsed. I mean, if you look at, I was following a little bit the results. I remember that the Greens really, so nothing. And 5 years ago, the green transition was the #1 topic. Now it is the number 3 topic after migration. So
is that because there are other more pressing topics, or is it because there's a disenchantment with green, or why?
Well, migration is definitely a populist topic.
Yeah. Have you got opinions on that?
I think one of the vulnerabilities is that if you look, it's a little bit stereotypical, but if you look at a lot of the more populist movements and the attacks that they are directing against individual groups, the prejudice politics, well, artists are very often part of those individual groups. The art community is a fantastically diverse community. That's the whole point of art. It's supposed to be challenging social norms and asking, forcing us to ask questions. And so I think there is a vulnerability of overlap here that the groups that are being targeted, then art is all, art is woke, and that is, nobody defines what woke is. It's just that the right don't like it. And so you then end up with that hostility coming through. And so I think that is a vulnerability, yes. On the other hand, and I say this somewhat cautiously, but I mean, art is also a business, because it is. And generally, the right, maybe not so much the extreme right, but the right like business. So there is a certain tension here. But I think in a world where culture wars, to use the stereotypical term, are going to be more common, I think that does create a point of vulnerability for the art world over the next 10, 15 years.
Till,
Yes, I'd like to actually bring the aspect of business into that sustainability debate, because from a UK perspective, what's very interesting, I think, is that, of course, all of those targets that Katalin described, they are not binding generally on the private economy, but they are prescriptive for UK, for example, UK public institutions. And of course, if you then want to provide services as a private enterprise to some of those UK public institutions, you are expected to abide by the same sort of principles. I'm talking specifically about your carbon footprint. Now, despite the fact that measuring and recording a carbon footprint is very, very vague at the moment, we don't know how that's supposed to be done. But I can foresee a situation where private businesses are trying to offset significant amounts of their carbon footprint in order to be able to keep open the economic interest in dealing with UK public museums and galleries. I mean, that's already the case in relation to shippers, logistics companies, insurers in the art world, who obviously are somewhat dependent also on the public sector. But then, taking this a little bit further, when you think about consignments of artworks, not necessarily only in relation to, let's say, a sale and purchase, but even an exhibition loan. If you're consigning a work for an exhibition loan and you're a private party and the consignee is a public institution, how do you then account for who takes on the carbon footprint of that consignment?
Yes.
Is it the consignor that takes 100% of that? Is it the consignee that takes 100%?
Yeah.
Or is it open for negotiation? In which case, it is almost almost like a currency, like a negative currency that you don't want the footprint.
And I would just add, I think that the private sector itself has customers who have certain expectations, and I think in the art world there is a lot more consciousness about environmental issues, perhaps, than the population at large. And I think it was very interesting, if you look when the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, the number of American companies that said, well, we don't care, we're going to follow the rules anyway, because our customers demand that. And if that's a sort of a mainstream transnational or global corporation that's doing that, I think in the art world, the pressure from collectors, from people in the community is also going to be very strong. And so, to some extent, particularly on environmental and aspects of social issues, perhaps the art world is held to the highest common standard, not the lowest common standard.
Well, I'm going to open up to questions in a moment, but before that, I'm going to ask each of you a sort of quick-fire question. I want each of you to say, right, we've looked at so many aspects of uncertainty. You know, navigating the sea of uncertainty is the title of this talk. We've seen VAT uncertainty, we've seen sanctions, who's applying them, we've seen divergence or not divergence between the EU, between Great Britain. We've got upcoming elections, there are so many things. So what is your number one piece of advice to our audience here to mitigate in as much as possible all of these uncertainties that are coming up? Paul.
So I think in this situation, the best advice is to be as well informed as possible, because this is a rapidly changing world. It's a somewhat chaotic world. So good information. So reading the UBS Art Basel Art Report is probably the best starting point.
Definitely. I totally agree. Till.
I'm going to be boring and agree with that completely, and just to say to be prepared for more uncertainty even than we've already got, because there are no indications that anything will become more stable anytime soon, I suppose, and just to be able to spot issues or potential issues and be open to looking further into those.
Katalin.
Well, yes, I have to follow you in this. But yes, I think that from the EU angle, I think that the EU, notwithstanding all these restrictions, I do think that the EU ecosystem of the art world is still very strong, I would say. I mean, in the EU, we have a very strong cultural background with a very strong collectors background, and it's a strong ecosystem. It's very different from the American. I mean, this is very interesting to always compare all these ecosystems, different ecosystems, and this is totally different from the American angle, from the American system and from the UK system. But notwithstanding the fact that these systems are interconnected, the EU system has its own mechanisms. It's a very sui generis system, and I think that. But now, because of the proliferation of the laws and regulations that are applicable to the art market and to the art world everywhere, I think you definitely need to be extremely informed. I'm not suggesting to have 3 lawyers when you have one transaction, but it's important. Yes. To follow
to consult
all these
specialists.
Exactly. This is essential today, I think.
Well, we have 2 lawyers and an economist, and I think everybody would agree that, yes, cover yourselves. I'd like to open up to questions now. Could you put your hands up, please? And if not, I have another question, so get your question in before my other questions.
We've beaten everyone into submission. Good.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Lloyd-Meyer. I'm curious, so we were discussing the aspects of how the American policy, London and French decisions were influencing the world. But what about the general situation? For example, the luxury goods. I mean, the last year, 15% decreased market of the wine. I'm curious about how much decreased the market of the luxury values that art basically is, on your opinion, and what are the things beside of the policy that are influencing them? Thank you.
Well, just very quickly, I would like to answer to this, that traders in luxury items are equally subjected to all these EU regulations, restrictions. I mean, for example, the new anti-money laundering regime, now it will be extended also its scope to not only to crypto asset
we were going
service
to providers,
but also to, and not only to traders in cultural goods, but also specifically to traders in luxury items and everything what you can imagine as definition under this concept.
And will that be extended as well? Does the same thing apply to the UK? How does...
Yes, I think the way sort of art and cultural property lawyers always describe themselves is probably including many other luxury assets and collectibles. So it extends very far and wide into that area, and you know, generally you would say the same rules and regulations apply. Generally, the same challenges in terms of. I think your question was probably more economic than legal. I suspect the same challenges, but I'm looking to Paul.
So on the economic side, there has always been sort of a strong tie between luxury and art in terms of the performance of the markets, mainly because the customer base for luxury and art is similar.
Yeah.
However, I think that since the pandemic, there has been a structural shift in the focus of consumer spending, which is immediately after the pandemic, 2021, everybody is buying goods because that's all you can buy. You can't travel, you can't go on holiday and so on. What we have seen over the last 2.5 years in particular is a distinct reduction in the emphasis on spending on goods and an increase in spending on having fun, experiences, holidays, meals, restaurant spending, and art, I think, is very interesting. Luxury tends more towards the goods. There's a fun element, but it's more towards the goods. Art, I think, is a lot more social. It's a passion. It is interacting in fairs, discussing in galleries. The social element is very strong. One of the things that's very interesting in the art report is the fact that although online art sales have gone up as an overall share of the art market, where obviously there isn't social interaction, people who buy art online still spend more of their money buying art in person. So there's still that real commitment to the social interaction. So I think that it's not that the two are separating, because you buy luxury goods in order to go out and have fun. You buy new clothes to go out and have fun. Not me, obviously, but people do that. So there is that element, but the two are perhaps parting a little bit at the moment. And that, I think, is something we saw in the detail of art purchases last year, that the volume of art purchases actually remained very strong. And it was just that the ultra high end was more cautious in the amount spent, but the middle bracket is probably not quite an accurate term, but the level down from the ultra high purchases actually increased the volume, and again that's related to the social aspect, I think, of art that came through last year.
Are there other questions? There's one there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Sophia, and I was just wondering how the UK art market has changed since Brexit, and sort of what it looks like for, the movement of artwork between the UK and Europe, and if maybe the UK has moved more towards America or other countries.
Well, we've got 3 minutes. I'm not sure how I can offer much in that time, but it's a very, very interesting question. I think we're still, the dust is still settling, and we will see how. I think that's part of the premise of what we were discussing. Will there be more divergence over time, or will alignment remain relatively close? Clearly, for the trade between London in particular and the EU of artworks, etc., it would be beneficial to have close alignment. Does that mean that there may not be other opportunities if regulation in the EU were to change in a way that undermines certain aspects of the art trade? Perhaps. So it's really, how does it all play out? We just don't know yet, I think. Obviously, it's created a lot of friction. It's really removed that sort of frictionless trade that was able before Brexit, that was possible before Brexit, and it's really thrown a spanner into many works in relation to what, at least this phase of the immediate post-Brexit world. So at the moment, there's a lot of bureaucracy and headache and pain, and not many, probably not many advantages to be seen. Will that remain the case forever? I don't know. Even in the medium term, I don't know, but it remains to be seen. I think that's probably
The second part of the question was, does it mean that the United Kingdom is perhaps going more towards America?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I think in relation to questions such as the AML, that would be preferable if, some sort of less heavy-handed approaches were looked at, like in the States, in relation to certain aspects of the art trade. However, of course, other issues like the AI regulation we talked about, perhaps it's better to protect rights holders and the creative industries rather than, institute AI. Although, of course, that's a broader economic question. Who do you want to go for?
Paul, perhaps you should.
If you look at the overall sales last year, so the UK went from second to third place in terms of value of sales. That's not a good guide. So it's not a good guide, firstly, because China comes out of lockdown effectively last year. So there's a massive boost in China. And it's China that moves up into second place. In the second half of the year, China then falls back as the economy normalizes. So in terms of the UK's relative standing, that switch from second to third place should not be overinterpreted in the context of Brexit. And then the second thing, this is always important to remember, of course, is the composition of sales. As I was saying earlier on, it's the ultra high end that have pulled back. And because the UK disproportionately focuses on the ultra high end of sales, in an environment where that sector has been weaker, again, completely independent of Brexit, you'll get a decline in the value and in the volume of the ultra-high sales. So I'm afraid I'm going to be a classic economist here and say it's very much on the one hand, on the other, with regards to the UK and the Brexit implication at the moment. There undoubtedly, it increases frictions and complications. The UK has an advantage in what economists call a clustering effect, that because there's already expertise in London, it's like a magnet. It sort of pulls in that expertise, and that's actually very difficult to break. And I think from a macroeconomic position, it's too soon to tell as to how significant this is going to be. We're not really seeing that convincingly come through in the macroeconomic data.
Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to stop because we've reached the little timer there has gone red. I want to thank our speakers, who I think you'll all agree have been fantastically informative and helpful. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Till. Thank you, Katalin. Thank you to the audience for your questions, your 2 questions, which were very good. And thank you to Art Basel for hosting us.